For now, it's my pleasure to introduce Heather Cooley, the Director of Pacific Institute's Water Program. She conducts and oversees research on an array of water issues, such as the connections between water and energy, sustainable water use and management, and the hydrologic impacts of climate change. Ms. Cooley received the U.S. EPA's Award for Outstanding Achievement for her work on agricultural water conservation and efficiency. She currently serves on the board of the California Urban Water Conservation Council, and she has a couple degrees from UC Berkeley. So with that, I'm glad you all could attend. This should be a pretty informative seminar, and please join me in welcoming Heather.
Okay, thank you, Garrett, and thank you all for being here today. What I'm going to do is go through my slides, and then we'll have plenty of times for question and answers at the end. So if you can, please do hold your questions. Today, I want to talk a little bit about seawater desalination in California, a topic of intense interest, not just in average years, but also in drought years. Before I do that, let me tell you a little bit about my organization. I'm from the Pacific Institute. We're an independent, nonprofit research institute based in Oakland, California. We've been around for 27 years. We work largely, although not exclusively, on water issues. About 2/3 of our work is around water. We work on water issues locally, nationally, and also globally. All of the work that we do as a nonprofit is available on our website at no cost. We've done several sort of studies and reports. I want to say 5 or 6 on seawater desalination, so I'd direct you to some of that work if you're interested in sort of reading more about the topics. It's a big topic. I'm going to touch on some of the issues, but please do check out those other publications for more information. So let's go first and look at existing seawater desalination plants in California. There are a handful of small plants. Most of these are for industrial purposes. That is, they're used for power plants, say, to produce boiler water. Most of those are sort of shown there in purple. I'm also on this map showing a couple of plants in yellow. Those are plants that were built but then have been put into standby mode. So they haven't been used or are not actively used. The largest of those is in Santa Barbara. So the largest seawater desalination plant currently is in Santa Barbara. It produces or would produce about 2.8 million gallons per day. It was developed or built in the early 90s in response to our 87-92 drought, but was then put into standby mode because as soon as the drought ended, the reservoirs refilled and there were some cheaper alternatives available. So this should give you a sense. Most recently, though, we did build a very small plant in Sand City. That's in the sort of Monterey area. That's a very small plant, about 0.3 million gallons per day. It is in operation, pulling from beach wells. And as you can see, just even across California, most of these plants are sort of concentrated in the Central Coast, the sort of Monterey area, and then a sort of couple of these in Southern California. Even though currently seawater desalination is a relatively sort of small amount of water produced in California, there is an intense amount of interest. This map here shows proposed seawater desalination plants along the California coast. There are currently 15 proposed plants and 2 in Mexico that would potentially provide water to California. Again, most of these are clustered in the Central Coast, Monterey area in particular. There are some real constraints on water availability there. And then a set of small plants, or excuse me, a set of plants in Southern California, not small. Most of these would be very large. In addition to these proposed plants, there's one very large plant under construction in Carlsbad, which is just north of San Diego, and that one would produce 50 million gallons per day. So it's a very large plant. It would be the largest plant, seawater desalination plant in North America. So this gives you a sort of general sense. These plants are at various sort of levels of proposal. Some are more in the sort of conceptual feasibility stage. Other ones are much further along and are seeking permits. They're going through either the Coastal Commission, in some cases the State Board. So we have a sort of an array. Many of these are not in response to the drought. In fact, these have been, in many cases, on the books for several years. And agencies are pursuing these, some more actively than others. So just to give you a sense of kind of where we're at right now. why are these utilities, why are these agencies considering these plants? And it's largely because of interest in improving water supply diversity and reliability. Seawater is a seemingly abundant supply of water just off our coast. Contrast that with the real constraints that we know we have in freshwater. Seawater desalination is largely independent of weather conditions. So, you know, unlike with some of our freshwater where we have more in sort of wet years and less in dry years, seawater desalination can provide a very consistent, reliable supply of water. If you contrast that with our demands, you know, our demands tend to be higher in our dry years and lesser in our wet years. And so there is this sort of offset in traditional freshwater that doesn't exist in seawater desalination, and that can be very attractive depending on where your local supplies are sourced. In addition, it provides source diversity. Many utilities in California, in fact, the majority of utilities are very much concerned of source diversity. They want to diversify the water supplies that they're currently using to sort of buffer them and make them less vulnerable to constraints in any one of those supplies. And so, again, seawater desalination is very attractive in that sense. In addition, it's under local control. This is in contrast, again, to some parts of California where they're very dependent on imported water. That's completely outside of their control. So having something that's under their local control that they can ramp up or ramp down slightly is something, again, that's very attractive. The relative importance of all of these things, though, are going to vary around the state, and I think that's something it's important to keep in mind through all of this. The advantages and disadvantages around seawater desalination are very site-specific. They need to be looked at within the local context and in comparison to some of the other options that may be available, and that's a topic we'll come back to several times throughout the talk. Given the interest, there are, though, a couple of key outstanding issues around seawater desalination. So we've done some work going back to 2006 on the topic, trying to understand what the advantages and disadvantages are. In 2011, the Pacific Institute launched an initiative to try to get a better sense of what people thought were the key concerns or the key issues. We interviewed stakeholders, a variety of stakeholders, several dozen, representing water agencies that were considering these plants, environmental groups, some supporting, some not supporting. We talked to state agency representatives, industry as well, to try to get a better sense of what they thought the key issues were. And there were three sort of issues that rose to the top. The first was on the cost and financing of the project. Second was around energy use and greenhouse gas emissions. And third were the marine impacts, specifically related to the intake of water from the ocean, but then also with the brine that's produced along with the fresh water and the impacts that can then have on the marine environment. So what I'm going to do in this talk is really dive into sort of each of these topics. So first around cost and financing. And let me also note that there are reports on sort of each of those key issues. So if you're interested, please do look at them on our website. In terms of cost and financing, what we found when we looked around California in particular, but we also looked at some of the plants that have been built internationally, costs are highly variable and site-specific. It really depends on how the plant's built. In some cases, it may be built right next to the coast. In some cases, away from the coast. In some cases, they may be able to rely on existing intake structures. In other cases, they'll have to build new intake structures. So it's very hard to come up with a single price for seawater desalination. That being said, when we looked at proposed plants in California, we found that the cheapest sort of, or the lowest cost we could find was around $1,900 an acre foot. When we looked at some of the smaller plants that were proposed in the Monterey area, those were coming in a little over $3,000 an acre foot. So the cost, again, highly variable. Some of the issues are around size. Generally, larger plants cost less per acre foot. Smaller plants cost more because of the issue of economies of scale. But again, any cost really has to be done on a site-specific basis. Generally, when we look at the cost, about a third of the cost is the annualized capital cost. The remainder are operating costs. That's really in contrast to traditional water supply in California. Generally, when we've built new supply, the capital costs are quite high, variable costs have been low. So this is sort of unique in that sense, and probably will require of sort of rethinking in terms of pricing of water. To give you some context as well, because I think some people have a sense of what water costs in California in this room, and some perhaps don't. Imported water in Southern California is currently at about $1,000 an acre foot. So seawater desalination is roughly about twice that. If we look, though, at new supply options, which I think people have acknowledged that there's not a lot of water sort of around the state, we are in a constraint. But if we look at, sort of, for example, recycled water, brackish desalination, those costs, or conservation and efficiency, those costs tend to be lower, although, again, site-specific analysis is needed. So, you know, it's important to kind of keep that in mind. In terms of financing, there have been a variety of sort of financing methods either used or proposed for seawater desalination. The most common is around municipal bonds. These are either revenue or private activity bonds in the case of the Carlsbad plant. This is really the traditional way in many communities where we have funded and financed large infrastructure projects, although not exclusively. Some do a more pay-as-you-go. But municipal bonds look like that would be a common financing method for the proposed plant. In addition, there has been both state and federal grant money that's been available for desalination. For example, for Prop 5050, there was around $22 million that was put forth either for construction projects, pilots and demos, or in some cases feasibility studies. There is money in the bond that could be available for desalination. It's in a chapter where it's sort of grouped with water recycling. Hard to necessarily say that money would be used for desalination, but there's some potential there as well. In addition to grants, there have been some low-interest loans that have been made available for desalination, and this is as evidenced in Prop 84. And finally, this is something we haven't seen a lot in the water sector, although it is coming to bear in Carlsbad, is private equity. So there have been some private equity investment for that particular plant. Hard to say whether or not that's sort of the wave of the future. Probably not, given that many of these are going to be sort of municipally owned and operated facilities, but it is something that we have seen recently. In thinking about seawater desalination, there are risks associated with these projects, and that relates on cost and financing. There are typical project risks. These are the types of risks you would see really with any infrastructure project. Permitting, difficulty in getting permits. There can be construction or operation risk. So that's that, something in the construction didn't work. There are also financial risks associated with these projects. But there are also a unique set of risks that we've seen for seawater desalination here in California and other parts of the U.S., and then also most recently in Australia. And that's called demand risk. So demand risk is the risk that there are other cheaper alternatives available and that you then build a plant that you ultimately either don't need or it's too large and you don't need all of the output. And that's, again, something we've seen. We saw it in Santa Barbara. I mentioned this in my sort of introductory remarks, a plant in the early 90s that was also developed with a connection to the State Water Project. The voters in that community were very concerned about the drought. Their water supplies were getting low. They voted to connect to the State Water Project and build a desalination plant. When the drought ended, they found that demand was down relative to what it was before the drought because of efficiency improvements that were implemented. And they also found that they still had other cheaper options available, and so they shut that down and put it into standby mode. They are, incidentally, looking at potentially bringing it back online because of this drought. The costs of that are still not known. They've put forth, I think, $800,000 to sort of study that. And they are potentially looking at a contract to bring that online. In addition, In Australia, there were, so Australia suffered from the millennial drought, which was about a 10-year drought starting in 2000. Many supplies there were severely constrained. It was the most severe, longest drought they had ever seen, and there were a lot of projects that were built in response. There were desalination, recycled water, tremendous amounts of efficiency, stormwater, rainwater capture, all sorts of things they tried to do. They did build 6 plants, very large plants, generally on the order of 50 MGD and even higher. They have those since shut down 4 of those plants and put them into standby mode. 2 of them are operating. Those are the ones near Perth. These plants, incidentally, were probably the most advanced plants in the world. They were powered by renewable energy. They had other technologies in place to make them less environmentally impactful. But again, ultimately, they found that there were cheaper alternatives available, and so they shut those plants down. Tampa Bay, Florida, a somewhat different issue. So we think of Tampa Bay, Florida, they have a tremendous amount of rainfall, so it may seem a foreign concept here, but they don't have mountains. They don't have snowpacks. They don't really have anything. They don't have rivers, sort of how we have rivers. They don't have anywhere to store that water. So they're very dependent on groundwater. Well, like many areas, they've been over-pumping, over-reliant on that groundwater, and have had tremendous issues. They, too, decided to build a desalination plant. They, too, have lots of ocean available, and it was seen to be some, a supply that they could easily tap into. That plant, eventually, it had some issues with startup, construction, contracting issues. It eventually came into operation. However, they typically are operating that plant only at a quarter of capacity. Again, this is that issue where there were cheaper alternatives available, and they really wanted to develop those first. So moving away from cost and financing, talking about issues around energy use and greenhouse gas emissions. Generally, seawater desalination is an energy-intensive process. Energy requirements vary, but looking at plants built over the last 10 years, which are using some of the best technologies, we're finding that they're generally using around 12,000 to 18,000 kilowatt hours per million gallons. About 2/3 of that energy use is associated with the actual desalting process. There are also energy requirements for the pretreatment, and for the post-treatment, and then also for intaking seawater from the ocean. So the general feeling, all of the plants being proposed in California are reverse osmosis plants. The general feeling is that we're really, there's been a lot of efficiency improvements in terms of energy use. Plants built today are using much less than they were 10, 15, 20 years ago. The general feeling is that we're probably at the best we can get. All of the plants are using energy recovery devices. There are some sort of minor potential technological improvements that could be made, but the real changes would be, or the real reductions in energy use are probably going to come from sort of technologies that are still in the R&D phase, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. But just to put these sort of numbers in context, this gives you a sense of energy use for seawater desalination compared to some of the existing and proposed water supply and efficiency options in California. We generally see seawater desalination is at the higher end of that range. Imported water, though, I will point out on the State Water Project at some points, these are not the coastal points, but the points just over the Tehachapi's, can be along the order of seawater desalination. Although that's as that water gets down to the coast, say in San Diego, it tends to be more in the sort of middle area of that second bar from the top. What this shows and demonstrates is it certainly is energy intensive, and it's energy intensive relative to the options currently available. I will note, and there have been comments made, the numbers I'm showing here include extraction, conveyance, and treatment. I've had treatment in for all of the other ones. Oftentimes when people compare desalination with some of the others, they don't actually include treatment, so it's not really an apples-to-apples comparison. But I did sort of smooth that out, and so this looks at sort of the whole big picture. Issues around energy and greenhouse gas emissions. As I demonstrated, the total energy costs are high. They're high as a proportion of the cost of desalinated water, and that then leads to increased exposure to short-term and long-term energy price variability. So let's talk a little bit about that. First, around long-term energy price variability. We know that energy prices are going up. CPUC estimates electricity prices will rise by nearly 30% over the next 10 years. This then means that the cost of desalination, again, it's an energy-intensive supply, could in fact go up. And in fact, if a plant is built and energy price goes up, the cost to then desalinate that water can go up. This, of course, is true for all water supply options, right? They're all using some amount of energy, but it impacts desalination more because it's a more sort of it's more energy intensive, and it's a larger percentage of its total cost. So that looks at long-term variability, but seawater desalination is also vulnerable to short-term variability, and I want to think we can think about that now in the context of the drought. What we find is that precipitation affects the cost of electricity in California. Not surprising. We have a lot of hydropower, and when we have a drought like this year, hydropower production is lower. Hydropower tends to be relatively cheap compared to the other energy options, and so when that's not available, we then have to make it up through the more expensive options. So what we tend to see is energy prices going up. This just gives you a demonstration of that. This is looking at PG&E's retail rate for electricity compared to two-year precipitation totals. And what we see, as I indicated, that as precipitation goes down, so if we're moving from right to left on the graph, we see energy prices going up. This is true not only for PG&E, but can be found for other electricity providers in the state, although not for all of them, I'll point out. If we look here, this is sort of a lot of technical detail for those that like it, but I'll walk through it for folks that maybe are less familiar. For the direction of correlation gives you an indication of the relationship between energy price and precipitation. So for the downward arrow, that means when there's less precipitation, energy price goes up. So we see a relationship between price and precipitation for PG&E, for Southern California Edison, for Los Angeles Department of Water Power, and also for Sacramento Municipal Utility District. We do not see that sort of correlation for San Diego Gas and Electric, and also Burbank, Glendale, Pasadena. Those are the ones we evaluated. We see the relationship and the correlation much more strongly, not surprisingly, for those utilities that are dependent on hydropower as part of their energy supply portfolio. So what this really means, you might be thinking, why am I telling you this? What it means is if desalination is something we want to rely upon more during a drought, it suggests that the price of that would in fact be higher. And for utilities that are considering that and that are considering ramping them up during these dry periods, they also need to be including that into their cost estimates. That so far is not typically done, but it's something we need to be doing going forward. The issues around energy, of course, as I mentioned, this was one of the top issues that were brought up. For many folks, the key issue was not really the energy itself, it was the greenhouse gas emissions that result from it. California did pass the Global Warming Solutions Act, vowing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels by 2020. There are no mandatory requirements from the water sector at this time, although there's some talk in going forward. There may be some requirements. There is some suggested reductions from the water sector that are on the order of 4.8 million metric tons of CO2 per year, and there's a couple of different ways that it was suggested that this reduction could come about. What we did is we looked at the proposed plants in California, which I talked about earlier. We also looked at their energy sources and the energy intensity of those energy sources, and we found that by expanding the seawater desalination by 514 million gallons per day, which is equivalent to the proposed plants, that this would increase energy use by about 1% over current levels, and it would generate approximately 1 million metric tons of CO2 annually. This is a very small percent of our current emissions, not surprisingly, we would expect that. But as you can see, it's sort of in counter to this. And there are a lot of ways we might be able to address that issue, which I'll talk about in my next slide. So the two major ways for reducing both energy and greenhouse gas impacts is first reducing total energy requirements. And there are a couple of ways we can do that. We can look at more efficient pumps and energy recovery devices. Again, these are pretty standard, common things you would expect in all of the new plants. There are also potential for making membranes easier to do the desalination process. There are also opportunities.
Typing. Can someone please mute your mics, please?
Thank you. Perfect. And what the research suggests, if we look at these two, the higher permeability membranes and the more efficient pumps, that there are some pretty modest improvements there. But really, if we want to look at sort of revolutionizing, changing, greatly reducing energy use, we need to probably look at some of these alternative desalination technologies, in particular forward osmosis and membrane distillation. And I don't have time to go into those into great detail. There's a lot written on them. Both of these are more in the R&D phase. There are some pilot projects that are being operated around the world, and there's potentially some great reductions in energy use and therefore in cost associated with these. Another way to reduce the greenhouse gas impacts anyway is to look at either powering plants by renewable energy or through carbon offsets. So the renewable energy, you're generally not going to see a desalination plant that's directly powered by renewable energy. Renewables tend to be more, at least in the short term, renewables tend to be more intermittent, right? They're when the sun's up or when the wind is going, and desalination plants need to operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So the membranes need to be utilized. So we're very unlikely. There is a lot of research going on, especially in the Middle East, to try to solve that issue. They really want desalination plants that are renewably powered directly. So it's something on the horizon, not something I see in the next 5 to 10 years. There is potential, and we saw this in Australia, where a desalination plant could offset its energy use, essentially paying for renewable energy feeding into the grid elsewhere. So they pay for wind or solar. All of these sort of strategies were done for all of the plants in Australia. There may be, at least in the short term, a cost associated with that could then further increase the cost of desalination. So, but it is a possibility, and it does address one of the key concerns that many people have brought forth. Carbon offsets are also possible. Carbon offsets are a little more political. There's some feelings that you need to ensure that the greenhouse gas emission reductions are actually achieved. We see few of these. Again, most people tend to go towards looking at renewable energy offsets. Okay, so I want to sort of shift gear. I want to talk about the marine impacts, but I also want to step back and talk about some of the environmental considerations more broadly. Seawater desalination has the potential to provide some environmental benefits. There's potential to withdraw less water from rivers and streams, to consider it a potential climate change adaptation. Remember, I mentioned that it was independent of weather. So some have sort of thought of and think about seawater desalination within that context. On the issue of source displacement or replacing a surface a river or stream, there has been some concern that there's no real mechanism or legal mechanism in place to ensure that that water is actually used to restore a particular ecosystem. Now, that's not the case in the Monterey area. In that case, there is a legal mechanism in place. In particular, the state board has required a reduction of withdrawals from the Carmel River, but that's very unique. That's not something you see in other parts of the state. So that's an issue that has been brought up, at least on the environmental benefit side. Desalination also imposes some environmental risks. Again, some of these, construction, some of the potential development, these aren't unique to desalination at all. In fact, one could argue that they're issues associated really with any new water infrastructure supply project. Some even, but there are some that are unique to desalination, and those are related to greenhouse gas emissions, which I already talked about, and also to the marine impacts, specifically related to intakes and brine discharge. So I'll talk a little bit about some of those, and then I'll be wrapping up and we'll shift over into questions. So in thinking about marine intakes, there's really two terms that come up. First is around impingement. That's where fish and other large organisms are trapped on the intake screen, resulting in injury and death. And then second are around entrainment. So that's where your smaller marine organisms, your plankton, fish, egg, larvae, those sort of things go through the intake screens that are typically used and then are killed in the desalting process. The thing to keep in mind, too, for a seawater desalination plant, they're generally taking in 2 gallons of water for every gallon of fresh water they produce. So they operate at, they call that about a 50% recovery. So they're taking in large volumes of water, resulting in both impingement and entrainment. The impacts, however, are not well understood, in part because we don't have a lot of experience. We don't have a lot of experience doing it in California. There have been, of course, desalination plants that have operated successfully around and have for decades, but they're not generally been in places where there's been any monitoring of what the impacts were or that there's been the concern about the impacts, nor have they necessarily looked at species that we find in California or habitats we find in California. So we don't yet understand what these impacts are, especially from a sort of ecological perspective. That then requires or will require, in my mind, site-specific analysis and ongoing monitoring to try to better understand what these impacts are and then to mitigate them where we can. There's several ways we can minimize the impacts from intakes. One is around design and operational measures, perhaps locating in areas with low biological productivity, improving the recovery rate so you're actually not withdrawing as much water, reduce pumping during critical periods for some of the species that might be impacted. But in addition, there are some technological measures that can be implemented. Most seawater desalination plants are using surface intakes. So that means it's sort of a pipe. There are, of course, screens on this pipe, and they are just directly withdrawing water from the ocean or from an estuary. There are behavioral deterrents that have been employed in some cases, strobe lights, air bubble curtains. Some of these have questionable success rates, a little bit debatable. More likely and a more common approach have been physical barriers, so screens that are on the intakes to try to reduce and or minimize impingement and entrainment. But in addition, what we've seen is a shift towards subsurface intakes. So these are intakes that are located essentially beneath the ocean floor. They are able to use the sand as sort of a natural filter. It helps them reduce or helps them eliminate impingement and entrainment. It can help reduce some of the pretreatment costs and therefore the total cost of desalination. However, there are some limitations potentially of that. One is the cost tends to be more expensive than these surface intakes. It's not necessarily can't be built in all areas. There are some limits on the sediment for which that technology could be used. But we do have and have seen some newer technologies developed in recent years, directional drilling. Some of you may be familiar with that concept with hydraulic fracturing. That sort of technology can also be used in terms of building these intake wells and building these subsurface intakes to minimize impacts associated with impingement and entrainment. So finally, around brine. So what is brine? A brine, as I mentioned earlier, they're taking in 2 gallons for every gallon of fresh water produced. That means they're also producing a gallon of brine that's twice as salty as the seawater. Typically, that brine not only contains salts, it contains some of the natural seawater constituents, things you naturally find in the ocean. It can also contain some of the chemical additives that are used in the desalination process and can, in some cases, have some heavy metals from the desalinating equipment, from the intakes, for example. Typically, that brine is simply discharged into the ocean or into an estuary. Brine, because it's so saline, tends to be very dense. So when it's released, it tends to sink down to the bottom, where it can then accumulate and pose impacts, at least locally, on some of the species that live there. And studies on brine, and this is a quote from a recent review of all the brine studies that have been located around the world, are extremely limited, often not peer-reviewed, not readily available, or have flaws in the study design. Part of the issue is that there hasn't really been monitoring before the plants were built, so it's really hard to say what the impacts were. So they've tried to do some other types of analyses, but again, we really don't know what the impacts are. We certainly don't know what they are necessarily going to be for California either. Much like with the intakes, there are some opportunities to minimize brine impacts, looking at discharging into well-mixed offshore environments that don't have sensitive organisms, looking at multi-port diffusers, which I show a picture of here. They essentially take the brine and try to circulate it into the rest of the ocean or into the immediate area so that it sort of dilutes more quickly. And then there's also opportunities for dilution, whether it be from power plant cooling water, from taking in more seawater, mixing it, and then discharging, or looking at opportunities to mix with treated wastewater. These top 2, power plant cooling water, for those that sort of follow those issues, coastal power plants are moving away from once-through cooling, so this isn't really an option in California or won't be an option much longer. In-plant dilution raises issues around your sort of switching between, you're increasing your impingement and entrainment impacts while reducing your brine impacts. So some have argued that's perhaps not the best sort of approach for dealing with that. And treated wastewater, there have been, certainly that's a way to take care of the salinity issue. You have a fresh water mixed with a more saline, you can more easily sort of match background. It does, though, raise questions around whether or not that treated wastewater could have been used for recycled water, for example. There are also concerns around the nutrients that are within wastewater and whether you're then introducing that into the lower parts or to the ocean floor and some of the potential impacts there. So moving on to conclusions, first is that currently seawater desalination is a relatively small component of California's water supply portfolio, although there is interest in coastal communities, and in some cases a very intense interest in developing this technology. The technology is viable. We know it works. It's been done in different places around the world. The issues, though, are not necessarily sort of technological issues. The key issues are its relatively high cost, its energy intensity and associated greenhouse gas emissions, and impacts on the marine environment. All of these, though, one could argue there are impacts essentially associated with anything. And so we need to kind of stop looking at seawater desalination in a sort of isolated manner. We need to kind of look at it as it compares to some of the other options available, the other options for local supplies, new supplies, and then efficiency options. Again, if you want to hear a little bit, or excuse me, read a little bit more on these topics, as I mentioned, we have a series of reports on our website, the address of which is there. And with that, I'll take questions.